Welcome, everyone, to Conversations with Impact,
the podcast for educators focused on making an impact and getting implementation right.
As a follow-up to our Reopening America's Schools Summit in May, each episode this year, we keep the conversation going and dialogue around the power of impact for implementation teams.
In this episode, we have the privilege and the honor to talk with Dr. Stephanie Arzanetti-Height. She's a leading expert in the power of collective efficacy. She has a new book co-authored with Jenny Donahue called Leading Collective Efficacy: Powerful Stories of Achievement and Equity, which is scheduled to be released soon.
Through real stories of success, Stephanie and Jenny explore ways leaders can develop and support a culture where collective efficacy is the driving force to improve student learning.
Together, we discuss her new book and make some incredible connections to the impact collective efficacy has on effectively implementing evidence-based practices that, in turn, lead to results. Our conversation with Stephanie was so much fun that it went overtime. Because it is such an important topic, we've decided not to edit the content to bring the time down. If you're unable to finish the podcast in one sitting, no worries. Just pause when you need to and return to finish the rest of the program.
We are Impact Learning and Leading Group, and it's time to talk about moving from hoping it happens to making it happen.
Together we're better. Let's get started. Wow, we are super excited today, Stephen.
Yeah, for sure. We've really been looking forward to this incredible opportunity all summer long. And to be honest, we've had great folks we've talked to, but I have been eager to talk to our next guest.
Yes, because we know 2021 school year has been like none before, right? School leaders are having to juggle logistical challenges, take into account student and staff safety, as well as being alongside, learning about new technology. The immense learning curve has just been very steep, while they're still trying to maintain that focus on high quality teaching and learning.
Yeah, so true. To support leaders and teachers at this really incredibly, I think, historically busy time and unprecedented time, as we know. We started out Conversations with Impact with Doug Fisher and Brian Dell, which was a great conversation talking about evidence-based strategies in this new distant learning world, and his new book called The Distance Learning Playbook. And then we followed up with Dr. Anthony Mohammed and managing change and adapting leadership during COVID-19.
The COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated that those who work in education, what we already knew. Schools are committed organizations, right? And we know that we're providing essential services that are pivotal to the community. We also know that to do this work, we really need to be clear on our goals, and we need to go together. So now more than ever, we need collective efficacy.
And now more than ever, the time has come. And we are thrilled to introduce you, our listeners, to our special guest today, Dr. Stephanie Arzanetti-Height. She's a leading expert in collective efficacy and has an incredible new book coming out this fall. And Janice and I got a sneak peek of it. We devoured it in 2 days. She co-authored this book with Jenny Donahue called Leading Collective Efficacy. So there's a focus on the leadership part on this one. Powerful stories of achievement and equity. So let me say that again: leading collective efficacy, powerful stories of achievement and equity.
We are so excited. And just to reiterate what we stated earlier is people have let go of some of the professional learning and bringing teachers and staff together. And so that's why we're really honored to have staff here with us today to dive into really working with that. When we started early on with our conversations, Doug indicated that he was hearing, and we've been hearing, that people have let go of professional learning and that they aren't bringing staff together to build that important collective efficacy. So we feel it's really honored to have you here with us today, staff, and to dig into the topics, because it is important during this time, important to get going on that. We love your new book.
Thank you.
Wait for it to come out.
Thank you. Well, first of all, that was the most warm welcome. I feel just, giddy to be here because I'm also big fans of both of you and your work. Your impact framework, I think, is it is a really nice companion to the work that we do. I feel like we're going to be part of a mutual admiration society during this conversation, because I really think the two go hand in hand. But I also want to thank you so much for the podcast. You've just waded right into the podcast world. And I think these conversations are super helpful, particularly at this time. So I'm thrilled to be here.
Yay, good. Well, thank you. And thanks for being a part.
Absolutely. We're going to dive right into some questions and get the conversation going.
Let's do it.
Research is becoming increasingly clear that collective advocacy is a means to foster, as Donahue and Katz put it, greater persistence, increased motivation, and sustained effort required to implement evidence-based practices. Wow, that's really saying what we know is we know what works. We know we need to use evidence-based practices, but it does take that persistence and increased motivation. So as you know, our implementation design framework for implementation teams has a key design component that focuses on building collective advocacy for that very reason. We call it the culture of collaboration. It's one of the pillars that get us going. So what our question is, we'd like you to share with us, what are some reasons that you felt it was important to make sure that educational leaders understand the power of collective advocacy as it relates to effective and successful implementation?
So I would love to give you just a little context about how this book kind of got started, got off the ground. Jenny and I had the good fortune to present together at a conference, so we got to know each other, and I kind of just emailed her on a whim, and I said, hey, you know, you've got this amazing background in the research. Your books have just been so inspirational for me, and I've been doing a lot of work in building collective efficacy with groups over the last few years. How'd you like to partner on a book? And she was, you know, just so accommodating and said, sure, do you have something in mind? I said, yeah, here's an outline and I've written a sample chapter and I'm curious what you think. And to be honest with you, at the beginning, she said, you know what, Steph, you don't really need me. I think you've got it. I'll write an intro for you, or, you know, but go for it. And I said, you know, I would actually really appreciate the collaboration. And I am so glad that I did that. I think that both of us really pushed each other to think this through more deeply, because here's the reality of it. We've been talking about collective efficacy for a long time now in schools. And we've been hearing from folks that we work with, we get it. Collective efficacy is important. We've got the picture. Can you now help us figure out how to do it, right? So it's time for more intensive guidance as to how we actually build collective efficacy. I think we've convinced everyone that that's really important, right? It's the belief that teams of teachers, when they believe that they can be powerful together, they overcome the challenges that face them. So we know how important it is, but it's really hard to actually cultivate. It's pretty difficult because we are talking about beliefs. So we thought it was time for something that was a little more, not instructional in nature, but more exemplary in nature. So we set out to tell what we call powerful stories of educational schools, big and small, districts versus schools. I mean, there's all sorts of different examples in the book of folks that have actually been successful in building collective efficacy, how they did it, and then we really pull that apart so that we can all learn from those examples. And we feel like that's the key to successful implementation, is to have a really good plan in place. I think it goes very well with your framework because that's all about the planning.
Right, yeah. Which is, I think, was why we love this so much. We were just we just really embraced the stories you were talking about and could relate to those stories. And as we thought about our own stories and the work of building teams to really focus on high quality, effective implementation and the beliefs that have to go with that, we completely related to those stories and thought, wow, these are powerful stories to have people to listen to and read and understand. So thank you for those stories.
Yeah.
I'm also, if I can interrupt one more minute, I am betting that you both have amazing stories too. And I think it might be time for an impact learning and leading book as well.
Well, that could be on the forefront.
Maybe coming, that's right.
Well, that's funny you mentioned that, because as I was reading through, and yesterday when we were getting ready, I was showing Stephanie all my dog-eared notes, which we can't show right now. But it's funny that you mentioned, because next to some of the examples and the stories that you had, I wrote down actual school district names, like, oh yeah, that's just like when this happened. And, you know, it was one of these, you know, large school districts that we worked with. We had over 22 elementary schools, but every school had at every grade level, K-5, we were working K-5 at that point, at least 5 to 7% growth. And that was across 22 schools for every grade level. It was like astounding. Well, that didn't just happen. It happened through, I walked through your book, I was like, oh, well, here's all those components to the collective efficacy. And we were focused on implementation and rolling out plans, but really they did such a great job at building teacher leadership and shared leadership and goal consensus. It just, so you're right, it kind of resonated with that. And I think our listeners and leaders and educators out there will probably feel that same way, right? They'll like, oh, I remember what, and have some of those aha moments, which we talked a little bit about yesterday and we'll get into later, but those vicarious experiences that give us hope.
Yep. I hope that that's the case, because obviously we know from Bandura, you know, the granddaddy of the efficacy sources, right? Those mastery experiences when we're successful are great. But we can also learn so much from those vicarious experiences. And I feel that the more of those successful stories that we can share, and not just, here's a great story, isn't it terrific what they did, but how they did it, why they did it, what were some of the bumps in the road, what were some of the challenges along the way. I think that that really helps all of us think about our own context and what we could do differently.
Well, I think that's what I appreciate about the stories in this book, because it drew you back to, so no matter where you're at in your leadership, no matter where you're at in this profession, whether you're a principal, whether you're assistant sup or a superintendent, whether you're a VP, a coach, a teacher leader, we can all think of times when we had a team of folks, whether it was in school or some other situation, where we were all in, right? We all believed we could do it. And then what that created, not only the synergy, but it actually produced what we were hoping to produce, because we were all moving in that same direction with the belief that we could. And so the stories, I think, were great pieces of reflection to think about. You know, I have had some of those experiences myself, and whether they were in school or not in school, you're right, those absolutely matter. So how do we build that so that we can capitalize on that kind of momentum?
Absolutely. The other pieces too are that social persuasion and emotion piece. And I think that we try to be storytellers, not clinical case studies, but really tell the story. Yeah. Because this work is super emotional. I mean, you know, we could be as intellectual as we want about it, but we know that when, affective states is one of the sources of efficacy. When we feel better about our work, we feel happier to be at work. We feel more confident in the work that we're doing with our colleagues. We are more efficacious, both individually and as a team. And so powerful stories really do help with that, right? We want to feel those kinds of positive emotions. And I'll tell you, I defended my doctoral research many years ago now. I don't even want to say how many, back in 2005. And I talked about some of those kind of emotional pieces that was part of my defense, was that trust and the emotions that are associated with trust were really important. And I'll be honest with you, those were the early days of understanding how important trust was. And I got a bit of pushback when I defended it. It was a little bit rough. And I think now we know just how important those pieces are. I feel very affirmed by that. I was onto something when I did my research.
Yeah.
But those pieces are critical. They're really essential.
Yeah. So wouldn't you like to go back today to 2005 and redefend it, right?
Yes. With everything I know now,
right? Well, and everything. Hopefully, those who you're defending it with or against, were, they now have a deeper knowledge and understanding, because our field is more flooded with how important collective efficacy is.
Absolutely.
So, due to your work and Jenny's work and others. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
So are we ready for the next question, Janice?
Yeah, I actually want to pop right back to, I want to focus a little bit, because you did that great intro and the preface is why we do it, but I want to dig in a little bit more and have you talk to us about because this is written with the leader lens.
Yeah.
And I really want to go back to the essential components because you mentioned, right, educational leaders, right? And why is it important for our leaders to understand the power of collective efficacy?
Yeah.
And as it relates to successfully getting anything they choose, right? Whatever the innovation, evidence-based practices that they want to get implemented,
Mhm.
why is it important that they consider and have a deep knowledge around collective efficacy?
Yeah.
So the leadership part can't be overstated, right? That's just critical. And in fact, I know we're doing a podcast, so there's no visual support right now. But if you can imagine that when Jenny and I first started on the book, we actually created a little graphic, and we had all of the 5 conditions in a circle in a graphic. And we both kind of dug in a little bit, and we were unhappy with that because it implied that all 5 were equally important. And we know that leadership is really essential. It creates the space, the container for all of this work to happen. So we recreated our graphic so that the other 4 conditions were kind of situated within the idea of supportive leadership. It's just absolutely critical. And I do want to put a little caveat on that. We typically, when we say leadership, our minds tend to think of formal school leaders, like principals and superintendents and the folks who run schools. They have those authoritative titles, right? They are in those specific positions that give them that leadership.
Right.
However, we really want to talk about the idea of informal leaders too. That because we know empowered teachers, which is another way of saying teacher leaders, is also extremely influential. And so I think that while we talk about leading collective efficacy, we don't want the teachers out there to think that this is a book just for your the people in charge of your school. This is for anyone that can step into a leadership role. And we believe anybody in education can step into a leadership role, and that everybody has something really significant to offer there. So we really can't stress enough how important this idea of leadership is. And in fact, this might be a bit of a digression, but I will tell you that one of my favorite things that I've been doing lately is to support the creation, or I've been co-creator in the NJEA Teacher Leader Academy, which is one of the first really innovative teacher leader programs that I've seen anywhere, because it's elevating teachers, whether they have a formal title or not, into that position where they can start to lead collective efficacy efforts. So it's really about everybody knowing their part to play. All that being said, we know that when the school leader doesn't have a good handle on collective efficacy, it can be a real problem, right? Because we know that when there isn't real cohesive understanding or a good goal consensus in the school, when teachers don't feel they have a voice, when we don't have some really consistent embedded reflective practices in place, implementations tend to flounder. And you guys know that from your work, we've seen it in our work. And so an awareness of those conditions and how to foster them is really a critical part of leadership.
It's really understanding the human element of our work and how that impacts our day-to-day practices, the quality of our practice, how it affects our presence with each other and our students. So it really puts a lens back on to who we are as human beings first, and taking advantage of the healthy part of being a human being and what we can do with that to actually maximize our effectiveness.
Yeah.
And isn't that so important right now? I mean, we are in the middle of this very challenging, not in the middle, we're at the beginning of a very challenging school year. Some schools have actually been in for a couple of weeks now, so they're just in the throes of it. And if we're not attending to the human element, if we're not attending to how we feel about how our work looks now, and how we feel about being either isolated or together and feeling risky about that, if we don't attend to that, the instruction just isn't going to matter. I mean, right? It just falls by the wayside. We all know that it's all about safety, security, comfort, and positive, feelings first. And then I can learn stuff, right? It doesn't go the other way around. Let me learn some stuff and then, quick, let me get somewhere safe. It just doesn't work that way. So we know it's all about attending to those relationships, both the adult relationships and the relationships with our kids, that are really critical right now. So the emotional part, anybody who takes it out of the equation is making a huge mistake.
Yeah, and creating the space for that to live, so that I do have permission to be able to say, this is not easy right now, and I'm really struggling as a human being in implementing this work. And to be able to say that, it doesn't mean that I'm complaining. It doesn't mean that I'm not going to do it with my full heart and soul. It just means I need to be able to express what I'm feeling and be able to create that place and know that that's safe without it appearing that I'm being negative.
I will tell you, I've done a lot of work over the years in teacher evaluation and appraisal. And that kind of hyper focus on accountability, it actually takes away a lot of the safety and security that we're talking about right now. I get very concerned about districts that are still really worried about teacher evaluations this year, when what we really need to focus on is building our collective capacity. And so that focus on individuals is I think, detrimental. I think we really need to be careful about that. And so supporting teachers to work together in meaningful ways, whether it's using the guidance of the impact framework or whether it's using the lenses of the conditions for collective efficacy, no matter how you want to go about it, thinking about how to embed those situations where teachers feel supported and safe and that their work has purpose is way more important than whether they get a 3 or a 4 on the evaluation rubric.
Well, and I just want to circle back to a couple things that you mentioned there around the leadership that at Impact Learning and Leading Group, we would just be, we're just so aligned, was that the hierarchy vertically and horizontally, and that when we're working with schools and districts or other nonprofit organizations across the US or globally, is like, if you're here learning, you're a leader, because now you have something you're going to share. So leadership isn't a title or a specific role. It's like, how am I going to move forward? And that's really why we have that cultural collaboration. And really, we know that building collective efficacy is critical. So you mentioned that leadership isn't really a title, and we would, emphasize that. In addition to that, you also mentioned, you and Stephen were both talking about those safe spaces. And one of the things that we would encourage people to think about is, rather than fidelity checks or checking and evaluating, it's how's it going, what do you need, how can we support you, so we can all get to the goal together. And we're going to talk about goal consensus and things earlier, because it's great to have a benchmark, and we all want goals. We know we need to aspire to goals. Nobody here today is saying we shouldn't have goals and check in and have high expectations, but how we get there together and how we can support staff. So you were leading into that. So thanks for diving into the leadership component and how everyone is a leader, and that as we move forward, we as leaders do have a responsibility to understand, how do we build those safe spaces? And what's nice about your book is you give those enabling conditions.
We give the enabling conditions, and also, I hope, some meaningful options for how you create those structures that actually do flatten that hierarchy. So, because I know it's one thing to say it, but it's another to actually do it. And so we do try to provide not just the, here's the thing you should try, but here's a couple of ways you might want to go about it. So we've got some examples of that in the book. But flattening the hierarchy is really a critical piece of empowering teachers, right? And the research is pretty clear on this. We know that when teachers have a seat at the table and they have a voice in decision making, things get better for students. And it's been verified by their test scores and also by closing of achievement gaps. And we think those are two really critical pieces to look at. We're not denying that we want our student achievement to go up, and we certainly want those achievement gaps to close so that we can address those issues of inequity that are popping up even more now that we're in this bizarre form of teaching that we're in. But so how we empower teachers is a really critical part of the work. One of the groups that I am a devoted practitioner of is the Art of Hosting Conversations That Matter, which does offer a lot of different structures of how to have large group meaningful conversations and how to really involve people in the work. And there's a saying in the group, which is that we believe there's a leader in every seat. And so the idea there is that if you imagine everybody on your staff is sitting in front of you, there are times when certain members should stand up. They should get out of those seats and take a leadership role, whether it's because they've got particular areas of expertise, or they've got the desire to try something new, or they've got the passion for a project. Doesn't really matter, but they can stand up and take the lead in those roles. And then naturally, in a group that really works well together, they can sit down and allow other people to stand up and take leadership roles on other topics. And a true leader has a mindset that they believe there's a leader in every seat, and they create the conditions where those people get to stand up and sit down as needed. And then the group benefits from it. And then most importantly, the students benefit from it.
Yeah, and I know you. Yeah,
That was so well stated, and there's a leader in every seat. And I love how you eloquently stated, providing time for people to stand up and sit down, because complexity requires group success, and nobody's going to argue. We are in complex times right now, and it's going to take each and every one of us and all of us demonstrating our strengths and skills at different times.
Well, and I know you didn't mean that metaphorically either. Like that's literal as far as standing. As a matter of fact, we in my leadership coaching, I do a lot of leadership coaching. I coach the leaders to actually take a seat.
Yeah.
Take a seat. Don't stand in the room and facilitate. Take a seat and let others facilitate. And then you'll see people actually start to stand up as the leaders in the room. And it's amazing what we'll learn from one another when we actually just kind of let go that I don't have to be the one standing in front of everyone. I can just simply take a seat, and now we're all on the same flattened hierarchy as you.
I think it's hard. I think a lot of leaders feel like their job demands that they be the one in charge. So I think this is actually a really difficult approach to leadership to kind of wrap our heads around. I think it's very tough. I will tell you that a couple of years ago, a superintendent welcomed me in to conduct some sessions with teachers at a school, and then said, well, how do you gauge, when you get started, how do you know if the work that you're doing is going to be successful? And I kind of looked at him and I said, I know it'll be successful if all of the administrators, including the superintendent, join into the learning with everybody else. Right. And he kind of looked at me a little bit surprised, introduced me, and left the room. So, I think this is tough stuff, right? We just don't have this understanding, this sort of historical understanding that leaders really need to be a part of this learning community and to have that mindset that everybody else can be a leader in that community as well. I think it's tough.
Yeah, agreed.
And they should be the lead learner.
Yes.
Right? And we would echo, we've seen that same thing, but we've also seen where superintendents and principals and coaches and everyone join in right alongside and roll their sleeves up and just are right there as that lead learner, modeling that learning and failing and coming together.
And that's what makes the big difference. That makes a huge difference, because that really builds collective. When we say collective efficacy, we're talking about everybody, right? Not just this little group over there. So you're absolutely right. When we see it happen, it's almost magical. People say, I was like, oh, it's almost magical. I'm like, it's not magic at all. It's really good, hard work with intentional design that we've all been thoughtful about. And that's how it happens.
Yeah, well, and even to the point where, and I know you probably have lots of, especially from the Art of Hosting, lots of suggestions on how to create that space, just even, removing those barriers and making it look like so that we're in some type of non-hierarchical position, that we're in a circle at least, or something that says that we're all on the same playing field. So yes, I can sit down as the positional leader, but if I'm still sitting in the front of the room, and everyone else is, looking at me, it still creates that, that positional piece, and just shifting that. I'm trained in the cognitive coaching world, and we used to use a term called visual paragraphing. And so if I would walk into a school to do some work with them, and they had the principal or superintendent deliver some type of pre-message before I was there to present or support, I would not stand in that person's spot, because that spot is associated with that particular person. Our brain associates location with messages. So the minute I put myself in the circle with everyone else, I'm no longer in a single spot. I'm now part of the team. So it's just, simple strategies like that can make all the difference in the world.
It is, and I could just divert us, down the rabbit hole with this, but I will tell you that the hosting structures, if people really want to take the time to learn them, are so beneficial. I use the World Cafe. In fact, Jenny and I talk about using World Cafe to revisit goals when doing implementation work, that we think it's a really great way to get everybody's voice in the room. Lots of folks have now been through World Cafes, and I want to say I'm on a mission to make sure that we're doing World Cafes right. I mean, it's really important that we don't just get together and talk, but that we really think very carefully about what we're talking about, what we intend to harvest in terms of the group's thinking, and then how we use that. And I will say this, I have found over the last few months, the World Cafe translates beautifully into the remote environment. And so I would encourage folks to really think about the idea that because we're working remotely doesn't mean that we're suffering in terms of creating those spaces where we can encourage every voice to be heard. The World Cafe format is an amazing thing to do with Zoom. In fact, I wrote a short little post for Ed Week, for Peter DeWitt's blog on Ed Week recently, where I talked about this, where it was kind of an aha moment that some aspects of the World Cafe actually work better in the remote environment, because one of the principles is that you should move to a new table and talk with new people in between each of our conversations so that we expand and diversify the thinking. And I've had folks admit to me that they don't really like to do that. When we're in a physical space together, they like to stay with their friends. They look for the people that they're comfortable with and familiar with. And that kind of doesn't really fit with the spirit of the process. In the remote environment, Zoom will recreate and randomly assign people to breakout rooms, and folks find themselves in a room with new people and they get into the conversation, and it's rich and meaningful. How often have we tried to facilitate and we've asked people to mix up, and the science teachers are still going to sit together and the third grade teachers are still going to sit together because, of course, we're humans and we want that comfort level. Online, we can actually really diversify the conversation and we can really hear each other. And that's how we get all the voices in the room. And that's how we create a leader in every seat. So I think this idea of considering the remote space as an opportunity is something we should also be thinking about right now.
Seriously. Oh, Janice, I have so many good ideas about what to do now with our next big webinar.
Yeah, be more interactive.
That's right. In your book, you provide really a beautiful connection between the early and late stages of implementation and the behaviors that typically exist during those stages, when there is either low efficacy or there's high efficacy. So, and using what we've learned about implementation science, we've actually labeled those stages as decide, plan, implement, assess, and sustain. So talk to us as to why you believe it's so important to strengthen efficacy beliefs early on during the initial stages of implementation, kind of those first beginning stages. In other words, why might it be important for leaders to collaboratively design their implementation plans with collective efficacy as a key component to their design process?
So I have to say, your implementation design framework is the perfect companion to what Jenny and I call the receptiveness to change matrix, which we offer in our book. And it talks about that sort of in the beginning, if efficacy beliefs are low and a leader comes in and says, here's the new thing we're all going to work on. What happens typically is that a lot of teachers will be dismissive of that, and they might even just try to avoid doing the work. How often have I heard from teachers, this too shall pass, it's a new fad in education, and I just need to keep my head down and ride it out until it's over. And so right from the beginning, an implementation can be doomed to failure if we don't have an eye to cultivating those efficacy beliefs.
Yeah.
And then the worst part is, over time, if those efficacy beliefs aren't attended to and they never really grow, folks get kind of grumpy, they're still trying to push this thing down our throats. It's just become an accountability piece, a checkbox, a thing we have to do. And they can actually get kind of combative about it, and it can really undermine an implementation in a big way. And then, often the thing that bothers me so much is often teachers are really blamed, right? So it's the teachers, they're not willing, they don't want to do the work, blah, blah, blah. Teachers. And nobody really says to the leader, well, hey, did you cultivate the right fertile ground for that implementation at the start so that it had an opportunity to grow? And I would argue that the collective efficacy piece really should be in place almost even before your decide piece starts, because if collective efficacy is high at the beginning of an implementation, teachers tend to be really curious and inquisitive and more willing to learn because they believe already that they have the power to overcome these difficult challenges facing them. And now this leader who I trust is bringing us a new evidence-based practice, a
Right.
new evidence-based strategy to try. And I trust that leader because we've had success together in the past. We have built that collective efficacy. So now I'm curious. Now I want to see how this is going to work. Now I want to see what's going on. And now as I work with it over time during the implementation, now all of those pieces in your implementation framework really come into play, right? Because we think about, is this working in our context?
Right.
No. Well, what should we do to adapt it? How should we innovate to make this implementation really work for us?
Mhm.
So the collective efficacy piece is really a critical, I would say, the critical starting point. When it's firmly in place, there's so much more potential for success.
It almost becomes, as you described, it almost becomes a readiness tool to determine whether or not an organization is ready to effectively implement something right and well. And I know we don't always have that luxury that we have to jump into that, but boy, what a great lens to be able to kind of think about readiness, and that could be very well a powerful thing to think about. Do we have this culture of collective efficacy? Is that trust built? Do we believe as a staff that we can do this? That we really are empowered to be able to make some hard decisions, to trial and error, and that error is part of success, and so on and so forth. So what a great lens.
Yeah. I love the word readiness. I really appreciate that you put it in those terms. I was focusing on the M and the C in impact, right? So it's the meaningful leadership and the culture of collaboration. Like those two things have to really work hard together. But I think the word readiness is actually a really important, like, are we even ready to try this? Because if we aren't ready, why are we spending time, money, and resources on doing it?
Right.
We got to get ready first.
That's where team comes in though, right? So it's like, it might be that the implementation team identifies how are we going to get ready, because not doing the innovation or the evidence-based practice, because we have kids' lives matter and learning matters. So how do we now, if we have identified a team and we identify that we're low in the collective efficacy, now we have somewhere to go, because we can focus on the meaningful leadership and the culture of collaboration. All the professional learning structure is going to be necessary so that we build readiness to, and we've worked with lots of large organizations that they say, we're going to do this. We're like, we need to work on it. And that's how our, the design framework comes about, because a lot of people go to implement and they're missing the professional learning structures that are necessary to start to build those collective efficacy beliefs, along with the collaboration and the culture of collaboration. And so an implementation team can identify that we're really low on collective efficacy. It might be the first place that they start. They decide we're going to start working on collective efficacy before we identify and put human and capital resources to this innovation, because we know it's doomed to adopt and abandon. We want to stop doing that.
Well,
yeah, because that's just it's just such a waste of our time and effort, right? To just keep trying to push things through because we heard it worked in another district. Let's just try it here without really thinking through what does that mean for us. And I heartily agree with you on the involvement of the team from the very beginning and using the lenses of collective efficacy. Like what do we have in place, and what might we need to strengthen before we do this work?
Well, what a great way to build that collective efficacy too, when they're part of, because part of an implementation team's role is actually identifying what the problem is that we're actually trying to solve. And what a great way to start building that trust and that collective efficacy, to involve our team, our teachers, in identifying what the problem is. So that they have the lens. So it's not just the position leader saying, here's the problem, and therefore here's the solution. Let our teachers actually be part of, here's the problem and here's the solution.
Yeah, when we are describing an implementation team, just for clarifying for our listeners, is not everyone's as familiar with our work, but we are always including implementers' voice on the implementation team, right? And there's teams that are going to be, vertically and horizontally throughout the organization, so you can scale effectively. Just for a point of clarification, and that's that flattening that you had talked about.
Yep, exactly. I was going to say that right there. That's that flattening of the hierarchy. And I think it's a good point to make it right now when the team is discussing, what should we do?
Mhm.
that we really want to be clear that collective efficacy isn't actually the ultimate goal. I mean, we do
Right.
want to build collective efficacy, but collective efficacy is what allows us to reach our goals, right? So if we
Yes.
have that collective efficacy, then we know we can get there. So it's kind of like the armor that we put on that helps us to be resilient when things get really difficult. It helps us be creative when we need to adapt. So it's I kind of think that everybody is sort of like, oh yeah, so we need to build collective efficacy as if that's the end point, right? No, that's the thing that makes the end point possible.
That's right.
Yes,
Fuels it.
we need to have a banner across the podcast right now. It's not the end goal. And you just led beautifully into the next question, because really you talk about those 5 enabling conditions that build the teacher collective efficacy. In other words, how to get toward that. But really what you dive into, and one of our very favorite chapters was the goal consensus.
Mhm.
And everybody's heard about SMART goals, or we think about, school-wide improvement goals, or short-term and long-term goals, data teams, PLCs. But goal setting isn't unfamiliar. However, the critical component, you both did such a great job in talking about goal setting as a way to foster that collective efficacy. And really, why don't you talk to us more about goal consensus?
Yeah, this was a tough one. I'll be honest with you. We had this chapter kind of later in the book, and we are telling the story of goal consensus with our colleagues up in Maine Township, which is a district right outside of Chicago. And I can't wait for readers to hear their story. They just have done an amazing, intensive job of really thinking about how to make things different in the learning environments for their students. And they are just such a great example of how goal consensus is a critical piece, because they started with this vision. And I think they started where a lot of people start, which is this notion that when we talk about goals, we're talking about everyone needs to be unified and we need a long-term vision. Well, we do need a long-term vision, but we kind of make the case in the book that you don't actually have to look for unanimity, that it's the actual process of developing the goals that builds the consensus, that it builds a common understanding, and it bleeds into those other conditions. Because as we work on setting goals together, we start to build our knowledge, right? So it's building cohesive knowledge. As we set our goals together, we think about our practice. So we start embedding reflective practice. If we involve all the voices and we flatten the hierarchy, we get teachers in the conversation, we start to empower our teachers. So goal consensus is super, super powerful. And then we also have to consider the fact that goal consensus isn't about just that long-term endpoint, but what are those mid-journey goals along the way? And then what are those small wins that are going to give people those mastery and vicarious experiences that we know are going to be so crucial to building their feelings of efficacy, both for themselves and for their teams. And so we use the analogy of sand dunes, which I hope resonates for some people. So when you look at sand dunes across the desert from far away, they look like big, smooth mountains that are just beige. And then if you got closer, you'd start to see the grains of sand, and you realize they're all sort of different shades of beige, and they're actually little pieces. And if you actually look at them under a microscope, they're a myriad of colors and shapes and sizes. It's almost startling how different they look. And we kind of think about that as a nice analogy for the goals. We do need those sand dunes. We need to know what that big long-term vision is going to look like, but we also need a way of checking ourselves on the path, on the journey to those goals. So what those mid-journey points look like, those are our grains of sand. But then if I'm a teacher in a classroom, it's great that I know what that long-term vision is, but I got to know what I'm doing with my kids tomorrow. So those small win goals, those small kind of teeny little microscopic goals that are going to be contextually specific for my kids on Thursday at 9 when I'm teaching science, that also has to be worked on and developed as a group. So I think it's really important to consider this whole idea of goal consensus as a process, not just a SMART goal checklist where we write them down, tick them off, and good, right? It's the process we engage in is really critical.
Yeah, one of the things that really, really resonated, and again, our work is so aligned, is a part of your goal consensus chapter, and what you're alluding to here as we have the big goals, then we have our mid-course goals, and then our small wins. We're able to involve the practitioners and our voice and choice is part of that. But a piece of it, because we're working toward that larger goal, then I can identify it and personalize it. I always like to say, like, well, it's like all jeans have two legs, you know, there's things that are similar about a pair of jeans, but then we all have a vast pair, right, as we fit in. So we can adapt those goals to meet the needs of our context, the climate of our classroom, our school, or our small group of students. We can contextualize them, but they're still aligned to the overarching goal. The piece that really resonated that happens as a result of that kind of goal setting is the adult learning. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about the adult learning component that is a part of the goal consensus. I think people generally think of goals as sometimes evaluative or punitive, but this type of goal setting really involves adult learning to impact student outcomes.
Well, I'm having some adult learning right now. I had never thought about goal setting in jeans category here. So I look forward to unpacking that at some point, Janice.
That one resonated for me. I will tell you, I have about 10 pairs of jeans in my closet. I always reach for the same pair. So I'm with you, Janice. I get the analogy.
You get to personalize. You can personalize.
Yeah, they are much more contextually appropriate for me, right?
Yes.
Happy to oblige. So I have to say that the Maine Township folks, their story for me is one of the best examples of representing adult learning that I've ever seen. Because we do describe how originally their goals really were focused on students, which of course is only natural, right? They had noticed some discrepant data in their district when they started to really dive into the data and make these decisions, right? So at the beginning of the implementation, they made a lot of decisions, and they really were focused on the kids in terms of what's happening for the kids. And it wasn't very long into their journey that they realized that they had to explicitly focus on the adult learning. And they set up this unbelievably robust coaching model in their district as a result, and created wonderful supports for this idea of adult learning. And so I just can't say enough about the work that they've done. I mean, the fact that they clearly have built collective efficacy, you know, unlike many other districts I've seen. I mean, it's really a very strong example that I hope folks are going to learn from. But that piece, that focus on adult learning is really critical. And you're absolutely right. We just, for so long, we measure success by what changes for the kids.
Yeah.
And truthfully, what happens is if we measure success by what changes for the adults, the kids are the ones who are going to benefit from that. We see that it absolutely has a tight correlation, right? So when things change for the adults in terms of our learning and our empowerment and our ability to be reflective on our practice and become innovative, guess what? Great things happen for the students. If you want to measure it by achievement scores, fine, do it, because those are going to go up. If you want to measure it by closing of achievement gaps, fine, because those are going to close. You could also look at student perception. You could look at family perception data. There's a whole lot of ways to measure what's changing in a positive way for a school district. And it really comes back to what's changing for the adults who work there.
Well, and I don't think you're talking about just randomly thinking about what do we need to learn or what do we want to learn and then creating this, you know, this smorgasbord of professional learning. You're really talking about kind of linking the two. So based off of the student learning, what is it that we need to learn so that we can do a better job at increasing or supporting the learning in the classroom? And then that leads to then what the professional learning might look like. Am I correct in assuming that that's what you're talking about here?
Yeah, and that's where that teacher empowerment piece really comes in, because we may have a long-term vision that we're going to close the achievement gaps in our school, and we're going to do it by increasing our attendance or student enrollment in AP classes, whatever our measurements might be. And then the question becomes for the educators, well, what do we need to do differently for that to happen? And that's actually pretty contextual in nature, right? Because if I'm an English teacher in the high school, my actions might be pretty different than the science teachers or the social studies teachers or the special area teachers or the counselors or whoever. So our actual adult learning needs might be really different. In fact, they probably are. They're super contextual in nature. And so we need to empower educators to say, this is what I need in order to make the changes, make the improvements. Then give me the supports that I need to make those things happen. Right. And it's all part of this cohesive goal that we hold.
Right.
together as a team.
Right.
But I think you're right. So it's this balance between that, having that cohesive vision and having some autonomy within the learning process.
Right. I wanted to circle back to your sand dunes, right? So we're still having that, we have the goal of the big sand dunes that are gray, but then as we get more granular and contextual, the learning that's happening is based on what skills do I need? How do I skill up so I can implement this evidence-based practice? But if we have strong collective efficacy, I feel safe and vulnerable as the teacher or the counselor or the principal to say, I don't know how to do this, and here's what I need or what we need, or here's a way that we can come together to be able to get the skills so I can gain competence to deploy the innovation, the evidence-based strategy. So we like to say, so we can skill up to scale up, right? And that's the adult learning but it's still based on that sand dune, but it's contextualized to the needs that, because you got, like you said, it depends on, am I in the high school or in the elementary? Am I, in ELA or am I in math?
But the
Yeah, I mean, go ahead, Stephen.
No, I was just going to say, but the implementers drive that,
Yep.
right? So they're the ones that are driving kind of that needs. Here's what we're implementing, and here's what we're doing to move towards that goal. But it's us. We're identifying then what is it that we need to actually get there. So versus somebody at the top saying, here's what they need.
Yeah.
It's driven from, our implementers saying, here's what we need in order to be able to make that happen.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. I think it's all about balance. Like, we're really looking for that balance, because I think that in schools or districts where we don't have kind of visionary leaders that are supportive in nature, that are going to share that information with us. And we do talk about this a bit in the book, in our leadership chapter, that the sharing of the data, how it's shared, right. What's the disaggregation that we're going to share so that it's very clear what's going on, that we get a dose of reality about what's happening in our schools and for our students. And then who is it shared with, right? Is it kind of in a tight little room with all the administrator, or is it shared out with the staff so that we all have a common understanding of what is the reality that we're working with, right? And so it's important to remember that with collective efficacy, when we talk about this collective perception that we can solve these complex problems, we're talking about an effect size that's more than double the impact of students' homes and communities, right? Yeah. So our ability to overcome, that sort of, I hate to say it, but historic blame of, well, that's where the students come from, that's who the students are, that's where they live. That is absolutely off the table when we look at the effect size research, right? We absolutely have the ability to overcome those challenges if we believe it and we work together on it. And so that finding that balance to do that is really critical.
Yeah, and it is critical, though, to have what we've talked about. We're talking about the choice and voice, but also what Stephen and I advocate in Impact Learning and Leading Group really is freedom within form, because we still have to keep our eye on, we do need some expertise, and we do need a goal. And that's where that implementation team is critical in helping to design, because we do need to build some skills to deploy a new evidence-based practice to be able to get the results it promises. So kind of keeping our eye on that, like you said, it's a tricky balance. So, but it's not a choose your own adventure.
Right. Well, it's a little bit, because choose your own adventure is within some parameters, right? So it's not just completely wild and woolly, right? It's like, and so we often say that with when we make decisions about what to try in our classrooms, there are good evidence-based practices of what has high impact on student learning. You shouldn't be off just inventing new stuff. Like, there's great sources to go to, and that's where that implementation team needs to present the options, right? Here's what we know is going to have the potential to really be good for our students. How do we now want to implement that, right? So that's that sort of balance between, we go with what we know works, we use the evidence, we use the research, we've got oodles of it, let's not ignore it, right? And then think about what our contextual adaptation might need to be. And you use the word design, and I have to say, I'm a big fan of making sure people understand that this is really a design challenge. And if you come from the design world, That's just not something I think educators really thought their job was, was to be designers. And so I think that's part of the adult learning that we really need to foster, is this willingness to jump in there with a prototype and experiment, and know that you've got supportive leadership that's going to allow you to experiment and find out what works and what doesn't work without any kind of worry about accountability or, punitive measures, and then redesign as needed and share that knowledge with your colleagues. Like, that's a really important part of this work.
What a great leadway into kind of this next question. And folks, we didn't set this up. It really is a perfect leadway.
Yeah.
Part of effective implementation design is building in ways we can actually assess the quality, the integrity. We'll use the word fidelity, but we actually prefer the word integrity, because it's fidelity with adaptations, which, it's those we have those perimeters around. We know what works, but there are some adaptations that need to take place depending on the context and the culture and the climate and their populations and so forth. So quality, integrity, and fidelity of the implementation. So continuing on this theme of goal setting a little bit, what role, let's talk a little bit about what role does the goal consensus have in assessing the implementation effectiveness? In other words, it brings us back to the design.
Yeah. So I love this part of it, and that's where I feel like that sort of we kind of landed on those three levels, right? That long-term vision, the sand dunes from far away, that sort of the mid-journey goals, and then those small wins. When we design that through together and we all have a clear picture of what it is that we're trying, what we're doing is we're developing success criteria. So we know that when we try these things, we have a vision of what success should look like. Right. And so when we try things, when we experiment in safe to fail situations, that we can learn from those, right? So that we know that in the design world, experimentation is critical, right? One of my favorite images, I know this is a podcast again, but it's a park where these beautiful brick paths are laid out, but clearly everybody who's used the park has worn a path by walking across the grass, because that's a more convenient way to travel. And so that's kind of like a nice little example of how we really need to learn from the experience rather than what we thought was going to happen, right? So we thought people would use the paths, they didn't. So now what do we learn from that, and how do we adapt accordingly? So the same thing really has to happen in our classrooms and in our schools. And if we've got nice, clear, coherent goals, we know what we're targeting, we know what we're aiming for. And so when we try things, we can then safely assess all along the way whether or not we're actually meeting those goals. So those kind of multiple levels of goals, if we waited till the end of the year to see whether we got to the sand dunes, it's way too late if we missed them, right? It's just not going to work. We'll be off in some other country, right? And we're completely in the wrong place. So we need those mid-journey goals, and we need those small-term goals with that sort of success in mind notion, in order to stay the course and stay on path in the interest of our students.
So think about, let me just extend this piece here, because I love what you're saying here. And Hattie will tell you too that the strategies that he talks about and he puts in his visible learning work, he'll also say, though, if you want to get the results from these strategies that they promise, that we do need to implement them right and well. We need to implement them as intended. And of course, I'm sure he'll also say with some adaptations depending on, culture, climate, context, or what have you. So talk about kind of that parallel universe, a little bit about experimenting. So we have these goals that we're working towards. We identify them together. We identified the strategies, the evidence-based strategies that's going to take us there. Mm-hmm. But then there's got to be some type of integrity towards that. Yeah. At the same time, we want to have that freedom and to explore a little bit about what's working. What does that do to the implementation?
I think that this is another place where a leader in every seat comes into play, because mm-hmm. I believe that whenever we try to embrace evidence-based strategies, in most large schools and large districts, there's somebody there with some really good expertise in that, and I think we miss the boat when we don't harness that kind of expertise. And however we want to organize it, whether that person shares the expertise in a professional learning session, or whether they model for other teachers or teachers get to visit their class. Right now during remote learning, it's really easy to visit other teachers' classes to see how they're doing things successfully. So we can have vicarious experiences all over the place with
Right.
that. And that kind of helps us understand how you might implement this with fidelity, right?
Mhm.
Because there's a really good, clear example for us to follow. And then think meaningfully about what nuances do I have to change for my students, because I teach a younger grade, or I teach a different type of class, or I have different content that I'm teaching, but I want to use that instructional strategy. Like those are those sort of nuanced adaptations that we would encourage, right? Because it's not really one size fits all.
Right.
But we have a really clear model of success, why this is a high leverage strategy, because we've seen it in action. And if we don't have that person in our district, you know, that expertise exists in the world, right? And now, particularly with the virtual contacts that we're able to make, I mean, the three of us are all across the country talking to each other right now.
Right.
We really can benefit from those expertise, you know, existing in different pockets in different places. And so I think there's almost no excuse for learning about what works. And I have to say, I get a little petulant about people clinging to historically tried strategies because they love them and they're comfortable with them, without thinking about whether or not those are really yielding the results that they want. So it's about really encouraging people to think about, what are those goals that we're going for? What do we want to change for our students? Then what needs to change about me as a learner and practitioner in order to meet those goals? And I've got great models out there. I just need to be a little bit patient and look for them.
That's right. Yeah, good. Great. Thank you. I think that's exactly the message that we would want to hear, and we would want to really talk about, that it is that careful balance, and not strain one way or the other, so where it just becomes either too difficult or so loose that it actually won't produce the results that the practice promises.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love how you said it's okay. Sometimes we'll have expertise within our organization, and sometimes we might need to reach out, but not hitting the mark isn't acceptable.
Right.
So
Right.
that's where I like you said, petulant. It's frustrating. It's like, oh, we can't do it. You know, sometimes we'll let outliers derail an implementation effort, when really we can say, okay, if we have a team that's going to problem solve, and we're going to, you know, assess and adjust and adapt along the way. So, okay, we can get to that. Yes, what you're saying is absolutely valid. However, we're still going to move forward.
Yeah.
Right. So we're constantly pushing for one of the things that, this will probably resonate with you too, with the hundreds of schools and districts that Stephen and I have worked with, as we've done this work, is that sometimes we find that when we have too many things that we're trying to scale, right? So that we can't develop the proficiency and the expertise. So our recommendation is to narrow your focus, so that there's 2 or 3 things that we're all, we like to say, this is a dragon I'm going to slay. At the end of the day, I'm really going to do precision partnering, or I'm really going to be able to, do this component. It doesn't mean we're not doing other things, right? We're doing it, but this is the practice that we're all collectively going to master and get to proficiency with. And we talked about that a little bit yesterday when we were getting going. Is like, I know it's hard to resist the Christmas tree, but we really want people to understand that the power of building collective efficacy, if we have a narrow set of goals and strategies, or components that we're trying to work toward. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Oh my gosh, there's so much to say about that, and I can't stress this enough. I mean, we've all heard about initiative fatigue, and the shiny object. And I've worked with teachers that are like, yep, it's our principal went to a conference, so we're ready for the next thing that we're going to try, because it's, and I don't blame leaders for doing that, because they feel like that's their job, right? That's their job, is to keep bringing the new thinking and bringing the new ideas. And so finding ways to make the work more cohesive is absolutely essential. And so one of the conditions is cohesive teacher knowledge. And I kind of like to broaden that notion of cohesive. Like, how can we stay the course, so that if we're going to entertain a new idea or a new strategy or a new thought, how does it fit with the work that we're already doing, right? It can't just be jumping to that next shining object. It's very, very frustrating. I think right now we're definitely feeling some pain points around that, because as we shift to remote learning, tech tools are now the topic of conversation, right? What are all the different tech tools we can use? And with the teacher groups that I've been able to work with to really meaningfully plan for remote learning, one of the biggest things we've stressed, and I feel very satisfied that this is where a lot of teacher groups are having this conversation, is to land on a decision about what are the tools we're going to use, be really clear about our expectations for their use, in the interest of not making our students crazy. The last thing our kids need is to log in every day and find out they've got to learn a new tool in order to write an essay, or a new tool in order to solve a problem, because the teacher learned about a new tech tool last night and that, now it's a new thing. Teams need to really land and be clear and to confine it. And it's not just good for the kids, it's also good for the adults, because now the adults can take the time to really thoroughly learn and consider how they're going to implement the tools. So it's the same thing with anything else. As adult learners, if you keep introducing, if every year I got to learn a new learning management system, I'm just going to lose my mind. I'm going to shut down and I'm going to stop using it. Right. And so this idea of being really focused and consistent with our practices, or, what we're going to learn, what we're going to concentrate on, is really important. It's a big part of the goal consensus. The goal consensus should help us narrow, right? It should help us think about, this is what's really important. This is what we're going to focus on. Robert Marzano, a long time ago, said it takes, I'm going to forget the number, how many times to experiment with a strategy?
24 times to get 80% retention.
Thank you for this. Thank you for the accuracy. But yeah, right? And how often do we give people that kind of opportunity, right? It's like, did you try it yesterday? It didn't work. Nope, let's abandon that and try something else. Oh my goodness, that's so frustrating. For adult learners, guess what? It's frustrating for the kids too, because you got a teacher that's swinging back and forth and trying all these different things. So it's an absolutely essential part of the planning and design consideration.
And because it's currently free or less expensive right now, doesn't mean it's the right tool.
Yes, thank you.
There's a lot of vendors out there who are offering their products at a very low price just to, there's a right, I think the right intention, the right heart, but I think there's a misleading piece there that it means that it's something that I can afford this, so therefore I should, because it seems like a great tool. But really taking stock of where our teachers are at and the things that they're having to figure out and manage and support. Keep it simple.
Yeah. I should share with you my first kind of baby steps out of the classroom and into more leadership work was around technology integration. It was, back in the early 2000s when we were pretty convinced that computers were going to completely revolutionize schools. And so that was part of my job. And I think the most important thing that I ever did was to reframe the conversations I had with teachers, because, folks would come to me and say, I really want to do something with blogs, or I really want to do something with Google Docs. And so I would ask them to take a step back and tell me about the instructional intention. What do you really want to do with your kids learning wise? Now let's pick the tool that fits that. And I feel like we're back in that kind of, it's like, I think Janisha said Christmas tree, right? It's like the Christmas tree where there's just all these tech ornaments hanging there and they're so shiny and attractive and we want to try all of them. And it's really essential that we get back to what the design is. What's the learning intention? What do we want for our students? And then we match the tool to it.
Yeah. And it fatigues our people, and it fatigues our staff, and it fatigues it's dangerous. I mean, it really is, emotionally and psychologically, and then just we don't get the results. So I think that we would really want people to hear very loud and clear that it's almost freeing. You can feel your shoulders release and say, let's pick 1 or 2 or 3 things that we're going to do really, really well. And that we have the financial and the professional capacity to scale. It may not, be the shiniest or the best, but this is what we can do, and we can implement it, as Stephen and I say, well and right, but we can actually do it with integrity, and we can all feel good about it. Because the other powerful thing about narrowing that focus is now, if the 3 of us are on a teaching team, I can go and I can pop into Steph's room, even if it's virtual or if it's real. I'm like, I'm failing. I just can't do it, because it takes it's 20 times of trying a new, this is Joyce and Shower's research, up to 20 times of trying a new implementation, trying a new teaching strategy to begin to develop initial proficiency. Up to 20 times. So when we have too many things we're trying, we can't master or develop competence around any of them. And so together, if we have a narrow focus, I can start to get competence, which builds my confidence, and we can lean on each other to learn from our opportunities to learn, which are our failures. Like, hey, this is hard. This didn't work for me this time. What did you do, Steph? Or what did you do, Stephen? Oh, I'm going to try that next time. Or I can go and watch somebody else do it, or we can come together as a team and we can problem solve around what was working, what didn't work, and we want to replicate those successes. So having that narrower focus and letting go of trying everything on the tree, even though it may be pretty, and can free us up to really build the competence and then develop confidence so that we're serving our staff and our students. And as you said, that we know that closes the achievement gap and it does raise achievement levels.
Yeah.
We're going to dive into another part of your book that we really love, and your emphasis is on supportive leadership. And in our implementation design framework, we call upon leaders to build structures, processes, policies, and practices that foster opportunities for the implementers to make meaning of the work and develop those organizational structures to build capacity beyond the positional leadership and facilitate that they can get the work done and that everyone has some decision-making authority. So what might be some ways that supportive leadership helps build organizational capacity to ensure effective implementation of evidence-based practices that foster collective efficacy? That's a mouthful.
Yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot. So I think we talked a lot about leadership all through this conversation. So I'm trying to think of now, how to kind of frame it in a little bit of a different way. I think that it's really important for leaders to really wrap their heads around their own leadership mindset. That's probably a very first important place to start. I mentioned before, I think a lot of school leaders are really unprepared for the idea of flattening the hierarchy. When you step into a leadership role, you feel kind of this burden of, I got to be in charge and I've got to tell everybody what to do. And there's an element to that when you're in that formal leadership position. And so starting to think about adding that dose of humility. I don't have to have all the answers. I've got a staff that's probably got a lot of great collective wisdom amongst them. That I really need to harness that collective wisdom in meaningful ways. So I've got to start to really think differently about how I approach this idea of leadership. So I think that's the very first step, is sort of unpacking your own understandings as a leader. And that goes for teacher leaders too. So I know we have a lot of teachers that are in formal teacher leadership positions. There's actually now teachers who they literally are called a master teacher or a teacher leader, or they're in a coaching position. And I think they've got to unpack their thinking almost in the same way. They have a more delicate dance, right? Because they're actually still a teacher, quote unquote, still a teacher. And then in a leadership role, which is tough. We don't really have that sort of middle ground in most of our educational organizations. So that's something else to consider. So the first, that unpacking of what do I think about being a leader? And then if I start to embrace this idea of flattening the hierarchy and creating this notion of a leader in every seat, what kinds of structures or designs can I put into place that are going to actually further that mission, right? So if I believe there's a leader in every seat, and yet I conduct a faculty meeting where I talk for 40 minutes, I am really not fostering the idea of a leader in every seat, right? We told a story in the book about a principal that I worked with a number of years ago, who was really concerned about sort of the grumblings during faculty meetings. People were checked out, they were just doing work, they weren't really paying attention. And so one of the things that we did was we really rethought the faculty meeting, right? So what is a faculty meeting? What's the purpose of the faculty meeting? What do you really want to come out of it? And she actually, I kind of joked about it in the book a little bit, because she actually called a meeting about meetings, which we thought was really hilarious. We're going to have a meeting about meetings. But the meeting about meetings was actually really good, because the folks had a chance to weigh in on the idea of well, what would be a more meaningful gathering time for us? And so as a staff, they really converted their approach together, right? So the principal really listened to her staff, and they converted their approach together so that the faculty meeting actually turned into a weekly newsletter broadcast. And there was a universal agreement with all the staff that they would read it, they would get the news that they needed, and so there would no longer have meetings where it's just information, right? Because you can read that, you don't need to talk about it. And they converted the times that they were together into much more meaningful professional learning opportunities that then became driven by the teachers themselves, right? So the teachers were responsible for bringing those success stories and those strategies that they were trying and sharing them with their colleagues. And it really changed everything about the level of engagement in adult learning in the school. So there's a structural shift that a leader could take to actually change the nature of how we come together, how we learn together. I am a huge fan of Peter Senjay's work, and he describes that transition from a community of learners to a community that learns. And it's a nuanced difference, but it's really powerful, right? So we can come together and say we're learning together, and that's fine. But what we have to do is really think about what changed for us when we came together for this workshop or this session or this, collaboration. What actually shifted for us? That's my favorite checkout question. What changed for you from the beginning of the session till now? Yeah. And when we start to wrap our heads around what changes for us as individual learners, then we need to move into what changed for us as a team. What do we have the ability to do now that we didn't have before? And that's absolutely essential that we entertain those options, because that's the only way to become a community that learns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it really just changes the brain lens on what we're paying attention to during that time as well, right? So if I know that it's about learning, and that I have a responsibility to learn during that time and learn from the people that I'm working with, that it's not about learning necessarily from a workshop, but it's about learning from listening to the conversation and participating in that dialogue. And then what am I taking away as a result of that conversation? It changes the way that we do our work completely.
It's pivotal. It's subtle changes, but so powerful. And it takes me back to, I'm thinking of, the sand dunes again and goal consensus. And so then that learning, such a great example of how that shift of what is the staff meeting really about? Well, now it's about learning. And we're all, we have your lead learner who's stepping aside and saying, what are we going to be, what are we going to bring and how are we going to do better? So that's really powerful. Thanks for sharing that. I think that really you did a great job describing an enabling condition. It's another thing that you guys talk about in supportive leadership is, providing enabling conditions. And we'd say, removing barriers, right? So she removed the barrier, and they started to learn together, and they probably have more success in getting, the results that they wanted.
So I'm a huge fan of Elena Aguilar's work. She wrote The Art of Coaching Teams, and she has a great exercise, which I have completely co-opted and I use with a lot of my groups. And we talk about the difference between a team and a work group. And I think that gets to the idea that, when you're in a working group and you've got a task that you have to complete, there typically isn't a whole lot of learning that gets done. It might happen, but the intention is not really learning. It's on accomplishing the job, right? It's getting it done, whether it's designing the field trip or, rescheduling for lunches or whatever it might be. So that's a work group's goal. But a team, when they come together, the goal really needs to be about the learning, right? What changes for us as a team by the virtue of our work together? What are we thinking about? What are we concentrating on? What do we want to change for our practices and our students? I think that's a helpful distinction, particularly when leaders are thinking about those structures that they want to try and put into place, is, there are times for work groups and there's time for teams. And as long as we name them, we really can meet those occasions, with more intention.
Yeah. Well, you talked about the story in this book around that principal who made that shift in their staff meetings. I think you were actually interviewing me in one of the schools that I led, because we had that we had that exact same experience, and it, and that's actually where I came up with this piece at the end, which is the reflective questions. And Janice and I actually use that every time we meet. And we've been doing that now since we started our work together. But what was missing in the field were, yes, I get the idea as a positional leader that I need to create those structures and processes. But I never got trained in those structures and processes in my administrative credential program. What are those structures and processes? And that's where I came across, and I'm sure you're familiar with the book called Groups at Work by Laura Lipton and Bruce Wellman.
I'm a big fan of their work. I've worked with them in the past. Yeah, it's really helpful in terms of protocols and structures.
Yeah, exactly. So every staff meeting, we stopped calling it a staff meeting, but every time that we met as a staff, boy, I pulled out that resource and went, okay, what strategy best fits what we're trying to accomplish, and then use that protocol, and it was. Every single time it turned into a learning event versus a meeting.
Yeah, and it's so important to think that through. And that's where I think that whole design piece comes in. And you're right. None of us learn that in our pre-service teaching programs. None of us learn it in our principal preparation programs. I mean, I've been through all of them and really good institutions. I'm not trying to bash on them, but I just don't think it's really been in our historical understanding that this is the role a school leader will play. You know, and so we now have to beef up our skills, right? We've got to go to all of these great resources. And you're right, you know, Laura and Bruce have that terrific resource. Art of Hosting is a place I go to often. Like I said, Elena Aguilar, Priya Parker, who wrote The Art of Gathering. She's been a really inspirational for me. I'm sorry, go ahead.
NSRF, the National School Reform Faculty.
Oh yeah, then we have
that website. There's lots of protocols.
Just so many. And I think it's important that we not get too protocol happy. Like, let's not get too crazy and just try, like, again, the Christmas tree of shiny
narrow down.
Right. We could go after all of those shiny objects in terms of protocols, just like we can with instructional strategies. So we do have to take care. One of the things I think that's really important is to try to match the content of our learning with the appropriate protocol or structure, to be really clear about what it is that we hope to benefit from it. And there's a lot to say about when we think of embedding reflective practices. There's another area where the word reflection, I think, has taken a beating over the years because it's gotten a little bit like, oh, if you've reflected, sure, I've reflected. It's in teacher evaluations and that sort of thing. We're talking about embedding ongoing practices that are really meaningful, where we get opportunities to think about our work, whether it's working the way we want, whether it's not, and how we could get support to make those changes. And having a consistent set of protocols that we're all really adept in using in those situations. So narrowing it down, right? Not all through protocol in the world is also an important part of that. Again, cohesion, focus, goal consensus.
Well, if you think about it, we don't learn from the experience itself. We learn from reflecting on the experience.
Thank you, John Dewey.
Thank you, John Dewey. That's exactly it. It's a good John Dewey quote. But you know, that's so true, though.
Yeah.
If thinking about even driving, you know, it wasn't the fact that it wasn't from reading how to drive. It was actually getting in the car and going, "Oops."
Hopefully, there's some
a little bit more.
We just hope it's not a big oops, right?
It's those opportunities to actually then really process what it is that we're doing that creates the learning. And I think that's what we are really talking about when we talk about meaningful leadership in our work, is really how do we say in those structures and processes that create those opportunities for people to make meaning of the work. And the only way they can make meaning is if they actually have time to dialogue about what they're doing, how's it working, how's it going, what are they getting the results, are they not, why and why not, and to have a self-learning opportunity as a result of that conversation. That's making meaning of the work. That's taking the research and now making personal connection to that research.
Exactly. I do worry about people's eyes glazing over whenever I say, well, the research shows and the research suggests, and here's what we should learn from the research. And everyone's kind of like, oh, you know, there's so much research out there. And so it is, you're right, it is about making it relevant. It's about us finding that common purpose in the work. You know, I think about Daniel Pink's you know, he came up with those three that really, really help us think this through. Autonomy, mastery, purpose. That's what motivates us. That's what gives us that incentive to come back to work every day and really power through it. And that purpose piece, yes, I need some individual purpose, but I also need to feel like that purpose is part of a bigger picture. And the leader is an important part of that. Like, so why are we looking to this research? How does that research help us? How do we integrate that into our work so that what we're doing has purpose? And that's where that meaning making happens.
That's right.
That was a great response to that question. And you gave us such depth and opportunities to some actually clear action steps to really enable that supportive leadership. Mm-hmm. And we appreciate you doing that, Steph. It's been so much fun talking with you.
So you guys are fun to talk to.
We've never gone this long before. We do have one final question that we did not give you ahead of time to process or think about whatsoever. The question is,
it's a big one. Everybody gets it.
Everyone gets. So if you listen to the last two podcasts, you would know what the question. You'd know what the question is. So here's the question. The question is, what trend would you like to bring back?
What do you wish didn't go out of fashion?
Right.
You know, it's funny. What popped in my head is I know what my husband would say. He would say 70s music. He wants 70s music.
I am
back.
with your husband right there.
I'm a current music girl, so I don't agree with that one. So I have a ready answer for this. This is actually something that I think about a lot. I wish that trust in science would be back in science.
Oh.
I am really concerned. I have a daughter who's a geochemist who's just getting her master's now at the University of Hawaii. And so we
Congratulations.
Yes, thank you. It's very exciting for our family because she's doing really good climate change research, which is super exciting.
Bravo.
And we've talked about this a lot, that we just feel as though historically there's this trend of a mistrust in science. And right now, more than ever, we need folks to understand just how critical the scientific evaluation process is, right? So, there is such an important level of trust that we can give. And if we really think about the things we use in our lives, we all trust science, whether we say or not. Every time you get in a car or an airplane or take a Tylenol to, get rid of your headache, we are trusting science. And so I really wish what would come back in style would be that people would now explicitly trust science and acknowledge the scientific work that gets done in the evaluative process. And we can start thinking really much more intentionally about making some significant changes in our world.
Yeah. Well said. And
that's great.
And to tie that a little bit to the work that we actually talked about today, a lot of what we talked about today is grounded and based in implementation science. It's grounded and based in improvement science, which are both actually real scientists. Real science, and they're actually real implementation scientists who study the role and work of implementation as well as improvement. And we talk about Patty's work and all the meta-analysis that they've done. That's been done as a result of research. So we do rely heavily on research, and we need to make sure that we're doing that in a lot of areas in our life. Mm-hmm. Well said.
Thank you.
Well, Stephanie, we're going to definitely need to have another conversation. So when we get off today, we're going to book another date with you, because this is just a wonderful conversation. We just are so pleased that you're doing this work, and really thankful that you are contributing to our profession in this way. What you have to offer and what you're communicating to our leaders and our teachers, and our teacher leaders, and our profession as a whole, is the power of that human element of collective efficacy, and how that absolutely matters in getting the results that we want to get. So, and what a perfect time right now to be talking about how important it is for us to come together and believe in the work that we can do.
Absolutely. And we will be putting a link to all our listeners. You can pre-order Steph's book. It's going to be coming out, Lead with Collective Efficacy, and you can look for that. We'll have a link for that in the visual webinar or
podcasts, and we will make sure that you have access to that.
I just want to say thank you to both of you. First of all, this was so much fun talking this through with both of you. And I just can't even believe how closely our work aligns. It's just been such a pleasure to talk to like-minded thinkers and thought leaders like you. And I appreciate that you're putting this podcast together, because I think the time is needed. This is needed right now. In these times, we need folks to come together and think through how we're going to address the issues that we're facing. So thank you both so much.
Thank you. We hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Stephanie Arzanetti-Height. We are thankful for her work on collective efficacy and appreciated the opportunity to get a sneak peek into her new book, Leading Collective Efficacy: Powerful Stories of Achievement and Equity. She co-authored the book with another expert on collective efficacy, Jenny Donahue. If you are interested in pre-ordering their book, you can purchase it now by following the link.
You can always contact us for coaching, consultation, for implementation resources. Like our Facebook page, find us on YouTube, and follow us on Twitter.
This has been a production of Impact Learning and Leading Group. If you enjoyed the show today, please tag a friend and share it.